Hello, my friends. So let's go to the question of the day. Let me see, which is this. When does financial security become an illusion? And this is a very deep question because sometimes you feel safe, you feel stable, you feel like everything is under control. But in reality, that security might not be as real as you think. It might be an illusion created by circumstances that can change at any time. And welcome, my friends. I'm Fred. Here we talk about business, investments, real life, and money, always from my personal perspective. And the thing is, I was thinking about this subject recently because it's something that can affect anyone. Financial security can slowly turn into illusion without you even realizing it. One of the main ways this happens is when your sense of security depends on a system that has always worked in a certain way. You start to believe that because it has always worked, it will continue working forever. For example, people feel secure in a salary, secure in real estate, in Bitcoin. They feel secure in a specific investment. But what happens when that system changes? We are seeing that right now with Bitcoin. Bitcoin has always had drops, but recently we saw drops of around 50%. And suddenly, many people who believed that they were safe started to panic and abandon their positions. The security was not real security, it was conditional security. It only existed as long as the system continued behaving the same way. The same thing happens with real estate. Let me give you a real example from my own life here in Brazil. Throughout my life, I built small warehouses and rented them out. That's how I built my financial foundation. But when I was younger, I used to walk through the downtown area of my city and see those retail stores in the center, clothing stores, shoe stores, those big commercial locations with very expensive rent. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the ultimate security. This is guaranteed income. This will never disappear. I believe that owning one of those stores would be one of the safest investments possible. I never owned one, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't afford it. Buying land in the center of the city is extremely expensive, and often there isn't even land available anymore. But I believed in that idea. And then something interesting happened recently. Not suddenly, but slowly. The internet grew, online shopping grew, delivery services grew, consumer behavior changed. Those central retail stores did not disappear completely, but they became much less powerful than they used to be. I remember passing by one of those locations recently. It used to be a large shoe store. Today, it is a dental clinic, and that says everything. Years ago, it would have been impossible for a dental clinic to afford rent in that location. Simple as that. The rent was simply too expensive. But now, the economics have changed, the demand has changed. The security that once seemed absolute turned out to be conditional. At the same time, without planning it that way, without any special insight, I had built warehouses in other areas of the city. They were not glamorous, they were not prestigious, but they were flexible. A warehouse can be a mechanical shop, a storage facility, a small business, a logistics space, a workshop. Many things. The range of possible uses is much wider. And because of that flexibility, they remained useful and valuable. This shows something Very, very important. Security that depends entirely on a specific type of demand can become fragile when the world changes. And the world always changes. Another illusion of financial security comes from salary. Many people believe their salary is permanent. They believe they are essential to their company. They believe they cannot be replaced. But the reality is that no one is irreplaceable. Companies change, markets change, priorities, and other people who believe they were safe suddenly find themselves without income. Their security was not real security, it was temporary stability. But here is an even deeper insight. The greatest source of financial security is not the asset itself, it's the person who built the asset. This is something many people misunderstand. People believe their security comes from their wealth, from their properties, from their investments. But in reality, the security comes from the capacity that allowed them to build those things in the first place. In my case, I built warehouses over time here in Brazil that created assets. But the true security was not the warehouses. The security was the ability to create them. Because if something happened and those assets disappear, the ability would still exist. And that ability could create new assets. This is why you often see people who win the lottery and become poor again. The asset came to them, but the capacity did not. They did not build the wealth, so they did not develop the mindset required to maintain it. Over time, the wealth disappears and they return to their original condition. The same thing happens with inheritance. Many heirs lose everything their parents built, not because the original assets were weak, but because the heirs did not develop the capacity to sustain and grow those assets. This shows that real security is internal, not external. It lives in the person, not in the asset. But there is another dangerous moment when financial security becomes illusion. That moment is when you become very comfortable, when you stop paying attention, when you stop observing the world, when you stop adapting to yourself. The person who built the wealth can become vulnerable if they stop evolving. This is the paradox of success. Success creates comfort. Comfort reduces vigilance. Reduced vigilance creates vulnerability. For example, imagine someone who built a valuable commercial property 20 years ago. Over time, that property became very profitable. The owner became comfortable. He stopped analyzing the market. He stopped adapting. He assumed the future would look like the past. But here's the thing, the world changed, the demand changed, and the value changed. And now, the security is no longer what it once was. This is why vigilance must never stop. It constantly asks yourself whether the assets you have today are still the best assets for the future. In my case, for example, whether it would make sense to sell some physical assets and move into financial assets like REITs or funds, not because my current assets are bad, but because the future might demand different structures. The greatest illusion is believing that because something worked in the past, it will always work in the future. So, financial security becomes illusion in three main ways. First, when it depends entirely on a specific asset. If your security lives in one asset and that asset loses value, your security disappears with it. Second, when you confuse the asset with the capacity that created the asset can disappear, the capacity can rebuild. And third, when comfort replaces vigilance, when success makes you stop evolving, when stability makes you stop observing. True financial security is not about having assets, it is about having adaptability. It is about maintaining the capacity to observe, to adjust, and to rebuild if necessary. Because the world will change. It always does. The people who survive and thrive are not the ones who depend on static security. They are the ones who maintain dynamic capability. So, the real question is not whether you have financial security today. The real question is whether you have the capacity to recreate that security if everything changes. Think about that and tell me in the comments what you think about this subject. Thank you, my friends. Thank you very much for watching, and I see you in the next video.